I think we were 120 miles from the nearest bit of dry land, like 200 miles from the nearest people, 700 miles from the nearest helicopter and Air Force base, and that was miles out of their range. And the weather was so bad. And I just thought, how are we going to make it out of this? Maybe this is it. When I graduated from Aberdeen University, I had a master's in marine and fisheries, and I decided I needed like one job just to get me going. And then I heard about this job where you could go and be an observer, a scientific observer on fishing boats. So basically you registered and you could get sent anywhere in the world, but I knew there was a high likelihood I was going to be sent down towards the Antarctic. And at short notice you'd be sent to go and live on a fishing boat and watch what the fishermen were doing and try and record what they were catching, but also, importantly, trying to watch to see whether they were catching things like albatross or other seabirds, what was going on with the wildlife, because it was in quite a special area. But it sounded like a magic way to get some experience and also, importantly, pay off some student debt as well.
And how old were you when you first joined the boat?
So when I joined the Sudur Havid, I was 23. I turned 24 on the boat, and straight out of university, quite naive, long curly hair, and a very bad beard. And it got worse. The more time I was at sea, it just got worse. I got a call to come down to London, and I was sent out to join a boat that I was going to be joining in Cape Town. When I came down to London, I didn't know which boat I'd be joining. There were two in port in Cape Town, and it was almost like the flip of a coin. But because I was lazy and I didn't want to learn another language, then the guy I was with took the boat that spoke Spanish, which was called Northern Pride, and I got the Sudur Havid. We pulled up at the harbour and there was this big gleaming boat, and that was the boat that my friend was going to be on. So Magnus got the Northern Pride, and then behind it there was this little rusting bucket, which was the Sudur Havid. And when you saw the Pride, her bow was above our heads. You know, she was a big, proud, gleaming boat. And then this little rusting navy blue boat behind her. And I thought, oh, what have I done? What have I done? But it was way too late to change by then. When I got onto the boat, I was rattling along the corridors trying to get my bags into the cabin. I was going to be sharing a cabin with this guy called Glenn, who was a second engineer on board. Met him, he was really nice. And then I met the guys who were in charge of the boat, and there were two enormous South African guys called Bubbles and Butty. And they were going to be in charge. Bubbles was the skipper, and then Butty was the fishing master, so he'd be in charge of the boat when it was actually fishing. And they scared the life out of me. Butty was really tall. He had a really neatly clipped moustache. He wore like sort of golf jacket and things around the boat. Well-spoken South African guy. Bubbles was short, wide, gruff, bearded, like dark eyes. You really wouldn't have wanted to meet him in a pub. He looked like a guy who would easily, well, both of them would have easily beaten me in a fight, so I was just the weedy little new guy. And they really seemed to have a good rapport with the crew. When I met the other crew, they really seemed to look up to Bubbles and Butty. They'd been on boats for a long time. They just gave off that, they oozed that kind of authority. And so I thought, well, you know, I'm in safe hands. They're friendly, and it should be a good trip. It took us like 3 weeks of sailing to get down to the fishing grounds. So South Georgia, where we were going to be fishing, is down like basically south of the Falkland Islands. It's really down towards down towards Antarctica. And it's amazing when you see it from the sea. You've got these massive glaciers and mountains with snow on top. We were fishing a long way from land. You're talking about, we did see icebergs on the radar, so there were occasional icebergs going by, but other than that, all you saw were waves, albatross, killer whales, sperm whales, which used to sleep next to the boat. And then occasionally we might see another boat on radar. And in that whole area of land, of water around South Georgia, I mean, you're talking thousands of square miles, there were 11 boats, and that was it. It's not near any shipping lanes, there are no other boats. You would not be down there unless you're fishing or on official business to South Georgia for some reason.
What was the early part of the trip like for you?
I was getting on really well with the crew. I thought that I wasn't going to be made welcome, because ultimately somebody's just watching you work. You're not going to make them feel very welcome. But actually the South African and Namibian crew were amazing. They just made me feel like they were looking after me. And I had no doubts they were really trying to keep to the regulations that they had to. So basically we were having great fun. It was plenty of banter on board. There was lots of good laughs. When we celebrated my birthday, then they got me horrifically drunk on brandy and Coke. So drunk I threw up in my shoes and had to get out in the middle of the night. But for a lot of the guys there, they were just trying to make some money. Just a couple of trips out, make some money and then get back home. And it was brutal work. I mean, Bubbles and Butty said they were taking it easy on the crew because we only had one line in the water. If they're fishing well, or if they hit a good patch, then they would have been working nearly 24 hours a day. But because the fishing had been mediocre, they were trying not to push the crew. So we were getting maybe 3 tons of fish on board, but every day. But this fish is worth a lot of money, like twice as much as steak. So that was a lot of money we were bringing in. But they said on previous trips they managed to bring a lot more fish. So there was a bit of pressure on the boat. The hold was slowly filling up with fish. And then we had this call to go and refuel with the other boat. So the Northern Pride was getting some fuel. It was cheaper if they refueled both boats at once. So we went up to the Falkland Islands, which was like 700 miles, refueled, brilliant, got a couple of days off work, refueled, and then back to the fishing grounds. And that was important later on, because what I hadn't realised was how low in the water the boat was sitting. We had a hold full of like 80 tonnes of fish, and we'd taken on 80 tonnes of fuel. So the boat was sitting really low in the water, and actually one of the crew said to me, like, look, Matt, there's water there, and underneath our feet there was a bit where there was a drain, and normally there would have been water draining out of it, but actually the sea was sloshing in and out of this drain. And I hadn't even noticed, but this boat was basically sitting really low in the water. So Saturday, 6th of June, I woke up to the roughest conditions we'd had that trip so far, like a lot rougher. And I stuck my head out the door just to see what I needed to wear, to see my crewmates basically being thrown around the deck. And it was like the deadliest catch. There was water being, like huge waves just coming across the deck and knocking them off their feet. So I had my clipboard, I had my arm up inside a plastic bag to keep it dry, bizarre. And then I basically stood there for an hour and watched all the hooks coming onto the boat to see what was happening. But every now and then you'd hear a big thump when the boat ploughed into the bottom of the trough of a wave, so right into the bottom. The bow would disappear underwater, and then a big wall of water would come along the deck. And I knew it was coming. It was really important not to look, because if I looked, I'd get the water in my face. But if I just watched Trevor, who was opposite me, he was facing the front of the boat, and I'd see his eyes widen, and then I knew there was a big wave coming, and I'd just brace. The water would hit the back of me, I'd be fine, but Trevor would get it straight down his neck. I can really remember at 10 o'clock in the morning, watching the waves were actually casting shadows on the deck, and that tells you how big they were. I mean, you're talking about waves that are 10 metres, so high as a chimney pot on your house. But just the sheer mass of them when they're blocking out the sun at 10 o'clock in the morning, it was crazy. And as well as the waves washing along the deck, you also had the fact that the boat was rolling from side to side and pitching up and down. It was just absolutely crazy. But I did my job. I'd kept up with the fishermen. I'd stayed out on deck. I hadn't complained about it. Finished out on deck, and I went back inside and warmed up. And then that afternoon I had to do a bit of work down in the factory, so I went down into the factory, which was down on basically on sea level, below decks. There were no windows, so you couldn't see where the waves were or sort of the horizon line. And as I walked down, you could see a little bit of water trickling backwards and forwards across the deck as the boat rolled. But it made kind of a nice tinkling sound. And one of the fishermen, Hannes, turned to me and he just said, "Oh, you're going to get wet today." And we were laughing about it. And one of the Portuguese guys, Shaquem, was videoing it to show his family the crazy conditions he had to work in. The situation didn't improve, and a number of us were trying to get people to go up to the bridge to tell Bubbles and Butty. So the 2 deck bosses, Shaquem and Carlos, had been up to see the guys on the bridge, the skipper. And then Charlie, who was like much respected factory boss, he'd been up as well. And they wouldn't listen to them. They just wanted to carry on fishing, just get the line in. It can't be that bad. It's no worse than things we've seen before. So eventually we managed to get an engineer into the factory, took one look at this other diesel standby pump that we had. Somebody got down off the wall, and he said, "Oh man, the only person who knows how to work that pump is Alpheus, one of the other engineers." So we had to go and get him. But basically, you had a bunch of fishermen who didn't know how to fix the pumps, trying to get those working, and the engineers wouldn't come into the factory. And the water was building up. Then I got to a point, Glenn, my cabin mate, eventually came in, and he came over and I said, "Look, we can't get this pump started." And he said, "Oh, well, we'll see if we can get these other pumps working at the side of the factory." And he showed me what to do. They were basically being blocked up by fish guts and scales. And he showed me to reach underneath the pump. And I thought if I did that, I'd get my fingers ripped off by an impeller. But he showed me it was safe. And we were doing that. And the boat was rolling backwards and forwards. And at one point, he was on his knees and he just disappeared underwater. So I picked him up off his knees and put him on his feet. And he was coughing and spluttering. And he explained to me what to do so I could do it. And I knelt down and was doing that. And all of a sudden, the pump started working. And I watched the water in this little cavity go down. And I thought, brilliant, I've sorted the pump. And then a little light went on in my head that the boat had stopped rolling. And instead of rolling, she was just lying on one side. And I thought, oh no, we've reached a real tipping point here. And I looked up, the water was nearly hitting the ceiling of the factory. The fluorescent lights were spluttering and sparking. And there were probably 6 or 7 of us down in the factory at that point. Out of 38 people, everybody else had left the factory and there were just a few of us trying to save the boat. And the only way out of that boat was basically along a corridor on the side that was now filling up with water. So I was thinking, right, I've got to get out of here. People were throwing life jackets down into the factory, but there weren't enough for Glenn and I, so we just decided we were going to leave then. And we climbed up on a bench, had our heads nearly touching these lights that were sparking, and we climbed out of the factory and into the main part of the boat. And there were all these life jackets just lying around on the floor. Like, we hadn't been issued with life jackets. They were in a locked cabinet in case the crew tried to sell them when we got to port. So because of that, somebody had knocked the padlock off with an axe, got all the life jackets out, and they were just strewn around the floor. I grabbed one, and then I went outside, and there were all the other crew, all lined up. They were waiting for a bus, life jackets on, oilskins on, some of them had bags. And I turned to Trevor, who I'd been working with that morning, and I just said, what's happening? Are we abandoning or what? And he said, yes, Matt, this is it. And I just felt this welling up of panic. So I ducked back into my cabin, and the curtains were hanging away from the porthole. Everything, like coats, were all at odd angles because of the way the boat was leaning over. And I just thought, what am I going to do? Like, just took a few deep breaths, tried to calm myself. And I thought, I've got my suit. I'll go and get my suit. And then I realised, like, Big Darnie, one of the crew, had said that people would fight with knives for a place on the rafts. So if we ever had to get off the boat, they would fight with knives. And I thought, well, if I go and grab that suit, they're going to take it off me. I'll need to do it. So I snuck up to the funnel where it was drying. And there was actually a door to get inside next to the exhausts where I left it drying, grabbed my suit, and nearly got stuck inside the funnel because the big, heavy metal waterproof door was so heavy I couldn't push against it to get back out of this when the way the boat was listing. And then a swell moved the boat, something happened, and I shot out of this door next to the bridge in my suit, with it half on, half off, in a fluster. And I was stood next to the bridge, and Shaquem, this Portuguese guy, came up next to me, and I said, right, do we launch the life rafts? So we had one life raft for 12 blokes, and there were 38 of us on board. So then we went round and launched the other 2 life rafts as well. And that was funny. Bubbles had said, oh no, Matt, I wouldn't bother. That one will be enough for us. And I thought, are you mad? We've got one life raft for 12 guys and there's 38 people. But we went round and launched the other 2 life rafts. And the crew then took those around to the back of the boat, to the stern, so that people could get ready to board them. And I went down the stairs to get to the back deck to where they were waiting. And I just had a moment of dread because I looked out at the waves and they were just basically all you could see were grey waves being torn to pieces by the wind. There were snow showers coming through. It was just awful conditions. All you could see for miles around us was basically the sea churning and snow. And I thought, I don't get how we're going to make it out of this. There's no boats near us. We're about to board life rafts and there is no land for miles. I think we're 120 miles from the nearest bit of dry land, like 200 miles from the nearest people, 700 miles from the nearest helicopter and Air Force base, and that was miles out of their range. And the weather was so bad. And I just thought, how are we going to make it out of this? Maybe this is it. And I just had a moment where I was like, right, I don't know what we're going to do, but this cheesy bit from a film came into my head. I'd watched Robinson Crusoe or something just before I'd been away, and there was a bit where like Man Friday was arguing, and they were talking about the fact they were about to fight somebody, and he turned to Robinson Crusoe and he said, all men die, but it's how you die that matters. If I die, I don't want to be a coward or to fall to pieces, so let's go down and we'll get off this boat and give everybody as good a chance as we can. So I went down the stairs, and there were the crew lined up, and we went along the crew one by one, me and Charlie, checking them and saying, it's okay, we'll be fine. Don't panic. And this was like lines that I'd learned in lifeguard lessons at school, just like in a swimming pool, being told to, don't panic, everything will be fine, help's on its way. And there I was, walking along the crew, saying that and trying to keep people calm. Still no call to abandon ship. So in the end, we just said, go, 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 get off the boat. And people started boarding the life rafts. And then I realised that there was nobody left. I was like stood there on these crates and there was nobody left, and I thought, what if there's somebody left? We haven't checked that there's, like, there could be somebody left on the boat. And so I climbed up along the boat to where the accommodation was, basically where the bridge was. And as I arrived there, our captain, the Icelandic guy, Björgvin, comes out of the accommodation with his suit. He had a deck suit like mine. He had his suit just pulling it on. And he'd only just been woken up. He'd slept through all of this. So he comes out of the deck accommodation with his suit around his waist, trying to pull everything on, and saying, Matt, what's happening? And I had to say, that's it. We're going. We're abandoning ship. We've taken water on. We're sinking. We're getting onto rafts. And then I turned and made my way back to the back of the boat, ready to board. But he didn't come with me. And then I turned around and realised that he was basically trying to help Bubbles. So Bubbles, the South African skipper, had collapsed in the water. And I think he'd maybe had a heart attack, some sort of an event. And then Björgvin got over the rail of the boat and jumped into the life raft that was nearest. And I basically manhandled Bubbles over the rail of the boat and I had him pinned in between my legs as I stood on the back of the boat, and I had my hand around. I had my fist like grabbed him by the scruff of his jumper. He was just in a jumper and jogging pants. And then I looked down and caught his eyes, and he was not right. You could just see he was just grey-faced, and caught his eye. And then the life raft came in underneath us, and his crew reached up, and then they dropped away again, so we waited. And then on the next time, I dropped him basically into the arms of his crew, and then paused, and then I jumped myself. So I was the last man off the Sudur Havid. And I landed in the middle of all the crew in the life raft, and it was exhilarating. Should have been this moment of terror, and it just felt like we were free. And I hit the middle of the crew, brilliant. And then we couldn't find a knife to cut the rope between us and the Sudur Havid. And the wind, I don't know if the boat had shifted or the wind had shifted, but we were then being pushed underneath the boat. So this boat, 400 tons, is lifting up into the air, and we were being pushed underneath. And at one point I could feel the hull coming down, this rusty, pitted, just rough iron coming down on top of my head. And I thought, it's gonna crush me, I'm gonna pop. And then worse was to happen, because then this big metal archway came down on top of the raft, and it just crushed the raft underwater, flooded it, full of ice-cold seawater, hit people on the head, crushed me. It was pushing against my cheek so hard, I thought it was gonna break me. And then the next minute, we pinged out and we're away. But now we're in a life raft that's flooded, basically waist deep in water. It's -1 degree C. The people are obviously shocked, but also I think some of them had been knocked by the girder as well. And we were pushed away from the Sudur Havid by the wind, and she basically sort of seemed to, the back end lifted up, the stern of the boat lifted up, and at some point she just went quiet, so the engines stopped, and that was the first time in ages that we hadn't had that noise of the engines. And then I started thinking, right, I need to get on and we need to sort this raft out. And I didn't see her sink, but one of the crew did and said that she basically settled down, and then the bow lifted up and she disappeared under the waves, but I'm quite glad I didn't see that. The waves were still crashing into the life raft, the storm was still going on. And to bail this life raft all we could find was a Nescafe jar. Like, I don't know why, maybe the crew had their cigarettes in it or something, but that's all we had, was a Nescafe jar and some Wellington boots. And we were laughing, we were still joking. I can remember pulling Darnie's boot off and saying, man, this thing's so big you could bail the Titanic with this. But it didn't work. And when we got it in the water, like the boot was so soft, it was no good to actually bail the life raft. And every time we bailed, we got more water in from the waves. So eventually we got the doors closed and we settled down, and just checking people around us were okay. So I was in a raft with the skipper and the captain and the fishing master. So Bubbles and Bjorgvin and Butti were all there. We had the steward as well, he'd abandoned ship in just his flip-flops and a t-shirt. So not well prepared. But we managed to get the doors shut and sealed down.
Yeah, what was the raft like?
So it might be worth describing the raft, actually, which is, they're about 3 or 4 metres in diameter. The one we were in was a bit bigger, so maybe 4 metres. They're inflatable. It looks like a giant kids' paddling pool, but with black rubber. And the floor on ours was bowed down by the water, but there's basically a rubber floor. And we were treading just like a treadmill on it in socks, just trying to keep up out of the water because it was bowed down so much. And then there's a canvas roof over the top, which is held up by an inflatable pillar. And around the edge of the raft, there's a rope inside the tubes that you can hold on to. So I found that if I held onto the rope and I just basically treaded with my feet, just kept going with my socks, I could just keep out of the water and keep a bit warm. After a while, we were trying to check where the other rafts were because it was starting to get dark. We'd abandoned ship at 4 o'clock. We knew that by 6 o'clock it would be dark. Maybe it had been damaged, but our life raft had no light on it. So we were in an unlit life raft. And it turned out that the survival grab bags that I'd seen Bubbles preparing, when we opened the grab bags, all they contained was basically some passports, a video camera, and a bottle of brandy. There was nothing else. Like, there was no radio, there was no flares, there was no radio beacon. All these EPIRBs that you've heard about, we had all of that kit on the boat and none of it was in the bag. As the light got more dim, then we all just basically settled down. There was no more talk in the raft. Nobody was asking questions. Everything had gone quiet and people sort of settled into their own battle to survive. And you start, thinking a bit about home. I can remember thinking that, maybe I'll never get to see my girlfriend again. Maybe I'll never get to have sex again. Distinctly remember thinking that, and that's just bizarre when you're adrift in the middle of the Southern Ocean. And then there's some really clear memories, like this really annoying vent in the canopy was next to me. I think you're supposed to put a radio beacon antenna up through it. But either way, it kept on blowing open in my face, so then I'd reach up and tie it closed. And then I'd reach up and try and tighten up my hood or zip up my coat a bit more. All of these things going on. And I remember looking down and seeing Trevor floating there in his life jacket. He had a big bushy beard, and we'd been laughing that morning, and he just looked really at peace, and I just thought, he looks really peaceful floating there. And then I got a call one more time, Matt, can you help me please? And I thought, I can't. But it was weirdly polite, and I thought, I can't not go. I can't stay here, I have to go and help. So I commando rolled across the raft one more time, I could feel things under me, like limbs. And I got to the edge of the raft, and Hannes was trying to seal the door down. Mornay, one of the guys, had been trying to hold the door shut with his own hand, just trying to hold it down, but the wind had ripped it up. And so we tried to seal this door down one more time, and just when we thought we'd done it, the wind caught it and ripped the door out of our hands. And this big blast of Antarctic air came in, just freezing. But I saw a light, and I thought, oh, there's a light. And then it went again, and I thought, no, I can't say anything because, maybe I'm hallucinating or something. But then the swell dropped, and there was a light again. And I said, there's a light, there's a boat. And when the swells moved, there was a whole row of lights, and I knew it was a red light. It must be like the side of a fishing boat. And I started screaming, to wake my raft mates up, but also because I didn't want the boat to miss us. And within a few minutes, this boat pulls up alongside, the lights were on the canopy, and we knew then that the boat was next to us. So we opened up the canopy to see this fishing boat like next to us, and it was huge. And they pulled me over the railing, put me on my feet, and I fell flat on my face on the floor. And then two fishermen grabbed me under the shoulders, pulled me inside, and stripped me naked and put me in a hot shower. And I can remember thinking, this is not the way you're supposed to treat a casualty. But it was so nice. And I turned around and turned it hotter. And then after a few minutes, I was taken through, like basically dragged through and put into the canteen, wrestled into some dry clothes. And I looked around and there were some of my crewmates. But in my little hypothermia-addled brain, I knew my brain was not fast, and I could look around, and Stephen, one of the guys, was right next to me. I just said, "Oh man, give me a hug. I got to warm up." And I wasn't even shivering. I was so cold. And gradually, the other people from my life raft were brought in. And just before we were rescued, there'd been this weird moment when Bubbles had started to do roll calls. So he'd been calling out the names of people who he knew were in the raft. So he'd be calling out like, "Matt," and I'd reply, "Yes, skipper, I'm here." But as we got closer to being rescued, the list seemed to be getting shorter. And my little brain had figured out that the list was getting shorter, and he'd said, "Butty, Butty." And Butty hadn't replied. And Hannes had said, "Stop, man, he's dead." And then I'd looked around, and now I could see that not as many people were coming onto the boat as there had been in my raft. But one by one, 7 of us were brought in to the canteen. And in total, from the first raft that had got away, 14 men were rescued alive, and all 14 of them had survived. And on my life raft, 7 of us had survived out of the 17, so 10 of us had died. And on the third life raft, which was Shaquem and Carlos's, that was found the next day, like capsized and empty. So the remaining, whoever had been in that raft had died as well. So we lost 17 of the 38 crew in total. 21 of us survived.
How did you feel the moment that you realised that the other people on your life raft hadn't made it?
There's moments when I know that within the life raft, I think I knew they were dead. Like I can remember looking at Trevor and thinking how peaceful he looked. And I think I knew he was dead. But I hadn't quite firmed it up in my mind. I hadn't quite registered it. Bubbles and Butty had both died, like basically next to me, and I hadn't realised. So the boat that had come to rescue us, it turned out was the Isla Camilla. She was from Chile, and she'd only returned to the fishing grounds 2 days before. Captain Sandoval had written our position on the board, and then he cut away his line, and he turned and raced to save us. They were 28 miles away when they heard our call. And like the most amazing feat of seamanship, he managed to predict with the wind and the tides and the waves where we would be, and basically arrived about 3 hours after we'd sunk, after he'd heard our Mayday call. And within probably 20 minutes of arriving on scene, he'd managed to find the first life raft.
How do you feel towards the crew of the Isla Camilla that saved you?
Best way of summarising how I feel was that a week later we were in fact it was 2 weeks later, we were in the Falkland Islands. But we were in the pub, and this little Chilean guy comes up to me and he said something in Spanish. And I looked at him, and the woman next to him, who was a ship's agent, had translated. And he says, "Do you know who I am?" And I said, "Oh, you're from the Isla Camilla." And she said, "But do you know who I am? I'm the one who pulled you from the raft. I'm the one that pulled you over the side." And his name was Jesus Posada. And he'd been one of the ones, and he said, "I pulled you over the side of the boat, and I kissed you on the cheek." And I said, "Thank God." And I had this moment, like we're in a pub, I'm drunk, but I had this moment when I was like, right, I owe my life to these guys. So I said to him, like, if I ever have a daughter, I'll call her Camilla after the ship. And it seemed like such a daft promise, but it was meant with like the best of intention. And it did not go down well with my girlfriend when she found out. But I made it, and it was like, that was exactly how I felt. They were magic, and they pulled us from the middle of a storm with such luck and skill that we owed everything to them.
And did you go on to have a daughter?
Yeah, yeah. Years later, eventually with a bit of internet searching, I was able to find Ernesto Sandoval in Chile, and I could send him a message to say that I'd fulfilled my promise and send him a picture of Camilla. And that was just magic, like being able to fulfill that and show him that the efforts they made were worth it, that they gave a whole lot of us our lives back. So he rescued 21 of us. And just all the lives that we went on to lead were basically due to him and his crew.
It's amazing.
It's as good as it gets. It's as lucky as it gets. If we'd sunk 2 days earlier, they wouldn't have been there.
Es horrible el dolor de estómago de no comer absolutamente nada, y es cuando te das cuenta de que empieza a surgir en todos al mismo tiempo esa idea. Y empieza a surgir en todos sin que nadie hablara con ellos. Yo el primer comentario se lo siento a Nando Parrado cuando le digo no queda nada en la despensa, y me dice: Carlitos, yo me como al piloto.